I feel like it's a timely topic to talk about an issue of ethics and how do we know what we're doing is right or wrong? How do we make those decisions for right and wrong? And it's one of those things that I think we sometimes can just assume or accept uncritically at times that, well, we just know what's right and wrong. And there's a lot that goes into that. And so, interestingly enough, my outside minor for my PhD was ethics. I've taken several courses in bioethics and in contemporary problems in Christian ethics. And so I've done quite a bit of work really in ethics and thought this would be a good opportunity to stretch those muscles that I haven't stretched for a very long time and talk about this issue of this theological subset of ethics as we go through that. So that's the approach that we're going to take this fall and sort of deal a little bit with the theory on the front end of the fall and then get into some probably some difficult application as we go through. Ethical problems are just always that, problems and difficult. And so we'll talk through those. Hopefully we'll get some tools here in the first half of the fall to talk about them well and not create a threat to anyone's job at any point. That's the dream. That's the dream. So we'll go through that. So anyway, all right. Well, let us then look at the issue of ethics. What is ethics? Socrates' famous quote is, ethics is the study of how we ought to live. So ethics is a branch of philosophy that studies issues related to what is right and what is wrong, and usually associated with reason, trying to come up with reasonable ways to know how to live and how to make decisions in the world. So philosophical ethics is the same thing as moral philosophy. You'll hear me use terms like ethics, morality, morals, moral philosophy, and I'll use those terms pretty interchangeably. There are philosophers who are very precise in their definitions of those terms. There's a difference between ethics and morals and moral philosophy, but I've never found that particularly helpful or convincing. And so I think they wanted to get published. That's just what I'm going to use those terms somewhat in a more fluid manner. Christian ethics is a little bit different. We'll talk about that in a second. But the idea is we're guided in this by what makes sense. That is in terms of ethics. Christian ethics, we have other sources of authority, but certainly here. Christian ethics is a sub-discipline of theology. And so it is not, strictly speaking, the same thing as ethics, because it is seeing other sources of authority besides just reason. We see theology, biblical studies, social sciences, and moral philosophy all figure into the issue of Christian ethics and deciding what that means. So Christian ethics tries to articulate a coherent vision for our practice and our living, what we choose to do and what we don't choose to do. So I just wanted to highlight the difference in those two, just the word ethics and Christian ethics, because right off the bat, you're assuming more sources of authority when you talk about Christian ethics. Biblical text, as well as tradition, church community. We're going to talk about these a little bit in a little more detail later, but all of those play a role of authority in shaping our decision making as Christians, which go beyond straight ethics, which focuses primarily on reason and the way in which it goes. But do ethics even exist? Well, there's the great question. There are some sociological, anthropological disciplines that in recent years observed, I say recent years as in the past 200, 300 years, observed that human behavior differed across cultures. Different people in different places have different understandings of right and wrong. And so the conclusion that many drew was that there was no objective basis for morality. That this cultural relativism, in other words, ethics, is simply relative to culture, and people decide right and wrong for themselves, and there's no way that any one culture can impose their view of morality on another culture. So if you're in a culture with a more communal understanding of property, theft may be something that is harder to define or even certainly not something you would think to prosecute, versus a culture that had more private property, more individualistic understanding of property, where theft would be an issue. And so those moralities don't really have a way to communicate with one another. And so cultural relativism is a term that was used to describe that. And a sort of subgenre of that is when you apply that down to the individual. Subjectivism. Subjectivism is just simply that I believe what's right for me, and you believe what's right for you, and ethics are simply a matter of opinion at that point. There is no such thing as right. But I think it is worth noting that, opinion does not control everything. I mean, there are those who believe that the earth is flat, and yet I don't think that's the best answer for our understanding of the world. Your opinion of whether or not the world is flat doesn't matter much to the world at that point. It will hold its shape apart from your opinions in that regard. And so objective moral norms may very well exist independent of what you believe or what I believe. And much of what we talk about in Christian ethics is an act of faith, but I also believe that there is it is worth exploring this question of ethics. Not enough to simply say, well, you do you, I'll do me, and we'll just kick off on Wednesday nights the rest of the fall. I think there's value in exploring this question as we try to decide what's right and what's wrong. All right, well, let's talk about the way in which ethics is normally talked about. There are three main categories of ethics. These are going to come up a lot in the course of this evening and in the course of the semester, so it's probably worth noting these for semesters. That's the way I think. We have a fall semester and a spring semester, and then the summer. It doesn't matter. That's how I arrange it. But these are the three main ethical categories. You can put just about any ethical system, very likely, into some version of these three. Character ethics, which is sometimes called virtue ethics. Deontological ethics. Deontological ethics is sometimes thought of as rule ethics or duty ethics. Deontology means a sense of duty that we have in this, what we're required to do. And then consequentialist or utilitarian ethics. Sometimes this last one is also called teleological ethics. Telos in Greek means end, and so it's the sense of the ends matter in utilitarian ethics. So we're going to look at these three different ways of really categorizing what ethics are, frankly, and where they come from. All right? Character ethics, virtue ethics, Aristotle is the advocate of these back in the 4th century BC. For Aristotle, the basic moral question was not what do we do, but what kind of person should we be? And Aristotle believed that virtues were like habits. You could practice them and get better at them. When you have what defines the virtues themselves, Aristotle did that one way. When Thomas Aquinas baptized Aristotle in the Middle Ages, he basically borrowed the virtues that we think of in the New Testament, the gifts of the Spirit, and some of the other virtue lists that we get in the New Testament. You can think of love, joy, peace, faith, hope, and love, those kinds of ideas. Aristotle, though, didn't have that source of authority, the biblical text, and so for him, Aristotle realized that any manner of excess tended to run you into trouble. And that finding the golden mean, finding the middle ground, following a principle of moderation in all things, will lead you to virtue. So excessive self-confidence is foolhardy and can lead you to self-destruction. No self-confidence is cowardice. So courage is the golden mean in that. That's where you find the middle of that. Pride is the right balance between bashfulness and vanity. It's interesting that humility is not a virtue for Aristotle, because for him, he found humility to be fundamentally dishonest. That's not who you are. You're not being accurate in description of yourself if you're being humble. And so pride is a virtue for Aristotle in that it recognizes your value, and it's in between, bashfulness or vanity. Generosity is the right way to go between stinginess and wastefulness. You can't give everything away, you can't hold on to everything, so you find generosity. So this is basically the way Aristotle did it. He tracked down the middle, finding the moderate. This is how he defined all of his virtues as he goes through. And these are learned by practicing. One of the dangers of virtue ethics is that it has been accused of, it leads you to navel gazing. You're really simply only ever concerned with yourself and the way you're living and what you're doing, and and your characters. There's no concern for others. There's no concern for any external source of authority. It is simply all internalized, individualized, and it's your living in the way in which you go. So it leads to that sort of self-absorbed, it can lead to a sort of self-absorbed way of living. So virtue ethics really, as a category, as a philosophical category, was kind of the only way people thought about ethics for almost 2,000 years. I mean, they thought of virtue lists. They thought, I mean, it's hard to overestimate in Western culture the influence that Plato and Aristotle have. And his sort of ruled the day. And even when the medieval church rediscovered Aristotle, because it had been preserved by the Muslims, thank you to Islam for that, when it came back into usage, they just sort of baptized them and picked up the idea and kept moving forward with it as they went. So this was a way that dominated the thinking of ethics for a long, long time, really until the modern era. This one you're going to have some fun with. Deontological ethics, rule ethics, duty ethics. Immanuel Kant is the poster child for deontological ethics. He believed that reason would reveal universal moral laws. Remember that for 1,000 years there was one church. And then for the next 500 years there were two churches. And then we got a new one every 15 minutes after that. Okay? From Martin Luther on. And for the first 1,500 years of the church, it was pretty easy to know right and wrong. Because you ask the church. You just go, is it right for me to do this? You go ask the church. I mean, they were the holder of all truth. It didn't matter if it was a moral question, or does the sun move around the earth move around the sun. It was the container of all truth. However, with the splintering of Christianity, we get what was in effect a splintering of truth. Right? Which church now is the container of truth? And so people began looking for this, what's the authority we need to look at? And this is when reason took over as this new authority figure from the church. This is when we get the birth of the sciences, 1600s onward. This is when you get math and science and Newton and Pascal and Descartes, and all of this comes in this time period when reason becomes the standard of truth. And so Kant is a product of that age. Everything is submitted, and everything becomes submitted to reason as the standard. So not just math, but even our history does this, and even aspects of religion. This is why the Thomas Jefferson Bible doesn't have any miracles in it. It takes all the miracles out. Jesus is just a good teacher in the Thomas Jefferson Bible because those things are beyond reason. They can't be explained reasonably. So Jesus is simply a moral teacher in that age. So he takes all that. That's the Jefferson Bible. So Kant is following, he's a product of his age as we all are, and he wants reason to be the standard by which we understand things. And so he felt that reason would guide, and an immoral act would lead to a logical contradiction. That he kind of believed the world was designed in that way. So Kant is most famous for developing what he called the categorical imperative. The categorical imperative simply is, something is always right if you can extrapolate it to apply in every single situation. So if you can extrapolate your current issue and your current decision to apply always and universally, then it would be right. So for that reason, and this is sort of Kant's classic illustration, you have your friend who's come, he's on the run from a murderer, asks you to hide him, so you hide him in your house. The murderer shows up and says, is this person in your house? The temptation, of course, is to lie. Kant would say, well, you have to ask yourself, can lying being okay be extrapolated to a universal rule? Well, it can't be. I mean, lying can't always be okay. Therefore, it would be wrong to lie in this situation or any situation. So you can't lie and tell them that your friend is not there. So the best that Kant would allow is you could not answer. But you could never lie. That's the categorical imperative. So he was a firm believer in setting up this rule for a living. No lying, ever. Because it can't be a universal rule to lie. Right? A lot of smirks. Anybody want to unpack the smirks on your faces? Yes, Bob?
Apparently, woman ever asked him, "Does this dress make you look
Does this dress flattering? I'm not sure what Kant's position on that is. That might be a different circumstance. I will say one other part of Kant's categorical imperative that I do actually think is worth thinking about a little longer than this first one is that you must always act in such a way that treats all people as ends, not as means. In other words, you must always be thinking in terms of individuals as themselves, of being humans of value, not as tools to be manipulated in some other way. But because of his rules of categorical imperative, you cannot ever lie, you can't ever steal, you can't ever kill, and that includes suicide. You can't ever kill oneself. So he is the king of all rule ethics. I mean, this is the rule that you can't do it. And so these rules shape and form. One of the things I point out, not all deontologists are religious, though I would argue that sometimes the way they talk about, if you're not a religious deontologist, when they talk about rules, they do seem to take on a divine authority when they talk about them. But many, as you rightly point out, many religious groups have deontological ethics in them. God has commanded that you. That's deontology, right? That is a rule ethic that must be followed under all circumstances. And when we have 613 of them in the Old Testament, right? 10 that are sort of broad, and then 603 that make very clear. You don't wear clothes of blended material. You don't eat shellfish or catfish or clams or other good foods. So,
and you have to repeat that.
I will. The question is Plato and Aristotle's vision of ethics based on reason. It was, and it wasn't that different than Kant's concept of reason, because Kant was, though 2,000 years later, still a product of Western philosophical categories of logic and reason. So we're dealing primarily in the Western categories here when we talk about this. And so, no, absolutely, he was still thinking in terms of that. Now, Kant would have a more developed understanding of scientific method and that sort of understanding, but it is still following the same notions of this is, A and not A can't exist at the same time kind of logic. That would absolutely be right in line with what Kant's thinking. Yeah, without question. I find it fascinating the way you asked that question. Bob asked that it seemed obvious in the Aristotelian view that not following the principle of virtue ethic would bring a consequence in that you're not going to be another person. If you, in the Kant view, he found that if I don't follow the rule and decide to be unethical, what's the consequence? In my mind, I hear the opposite. Because in my mind, if you are an Aristotelian, if you're viewing this as an Aristotelian, not being ethical means that you are either on the path to psycho. You're going to be a psychopath. You're going to be an amoral person. But maybe you don't care. You're going to be an amoral person. The deontological views usually have an authority figure enforcing them. These deontology ideas come from someplace. Now, Kant tried to believe they came from practical reason, but the church is backing that up, or the state is backing that up, or whoever gave you the rules that are listed out is backing that up. In violation of that, there are consequences for it. You're crossing the authority figure for whomever gave you the rules at the end of the day. Excellent point. Yeah, the excesses on either end of the virtue ethic extreme, if you're not finding that golden mean, come with their own consequence. Cowardice or foolhardiness. Yeah, that's an excellent point. I hadn't considered being amoral to that degree. I was being a little amoral. You took it to
slightly off center.
I was slightly off center. Bob made it to the extremes to help me understand that. Yeah, well done. Yeah, but this is common. Deontology is very common in religious systems, right? We get that, and in our laws, right? Speeding and all the rest. Those are all written right into the way in which we live when we get a society together. The third category we talked about was utilitarian, consequentialist, or teleological ethics. John Stuart Mill is one of the more famous advocates for this. Right and wrong are evaluated solely by the consequences that the action will end up bringing. And actions that bring the most good are the ones that are right. Actions that don't bring good are not. Mill categorized good in terms of happiness. So an action that brings the most happiness for the most people, for Mill, was the right action. That's how you, truth or not. Another way of saying is seek the best consequences for the most people, of everyone concerned, right? The most people. This sort of has the opposite problem of virtue ethics, where consequentialist or utilitarian ethics taken to its extreme tries to turn you into a happiness factory that is trying to make everyone happy all the time to an almost ascetic denial of self at that point. Because obviously, if you can make more people happy, it doesn't matter what you believe, what you get out of it. You need to make the most people happy possible. But this is, I think if I remember right, Mill actually had a calculus of felicity, a way in which you could count up how you know the impact of the happiness, the far-reachingness of the happiness, the number of people involved. He had all these different categories that you put into the formula of the calculus of felicity, which I just think is a great thing. The calculus of felicity is just a great turn of phrase. I don't know, I just like that. It rolls off the tongue. But that is the utilitarian. This is concerned with ends more than anything else. Means can be bad if the ends bring more good than the bad that means bring. Okay. I'm not saying the ends justify the means, because I don't know that ever quoting Machiavelli is a great idea, but it is at least has less regard for means than it does ends on this. Because again, how much good? And obviously, if the means themselves bring unhappiness, that figures into the calculus as well. Where are we coming at the ends of this? That's the more important part of it. Joseph Fletcher had a subset of this that I know you're familiar with, the situation ethics. This was a baptized version of utilitarian, except that for him, rather than a calculus of felicity, one should be bringing as much love, Jesus' love in the world as possible. So you calculate loving consequences as opposed to happiness consequences, but it's effectively a utilitarian approach. What is interesting about it is that this is probably, unconsciously even, the most popular ethical system that people use, most of the time without even realizing it. This is the one that is the basic. It's funny because I I told you I did a couple of courses in bioethics, and all of that is dealing with, any issue of health with regard to this. So whether it's conception or euthanasia or any ethical issue that can come up with regard to life is covered under bioethics. And so much so that there's a 4-volume encyclopedia of bioethics that you can look up an issue and see, what ethical issues are involved, what people have said, what suggestions what one might make in this. And a grad student who's, I'm no doubt looking for a dissertation topic, went through and evaluated all of the articles in the Encyclopedia of Bioethics to classify them to see which of these 3 categories that it might fall into. Is it a character ethic, deontological ethic, or consequentialist or utilitarian ethic? And at the end of his research, 85% of the articles were utilitarian. At the end of the day, it was always about the ends. Almost always about the ends in the article. So it is one of those that is pretty far-reaching. And like I said, it's one that I think a lot of people accept without even thinking about it. You want to go with all of the above?
I think maybe I'll go with all of the above.
That's probably a safe answer in this case. Yeah, this is probably. I think any ethical system that's not taking into account all of these things is going to be incomplete. I do. Personally, deontological ethics. That is incredibly important for shaping and forming. That's how we teach our children, is with deontological ethics, right? We make rules about making the bed and cleaning the room and washing dishes and going at bedtimes. There are rules that are observed. Those rules are not universal and absolute, and as they grow up, those things change, and we learn to hope that they are forming their character on their own when that happens. But that is absolutely the way we form character. The rules are the ways in which we really do show what we value and what we find to be important, what we've anticipated as value and important. I also think that we need to be shaped by this. I do think what kind of a person do I need to be is a good question to ask. And I do think that that faith is a muscle, right? I do think that if you exercise it in a small way, you learn to exercise it in a large way. I do think that we can grow in virtue as we go. So I think Aristotle could be right on that. And I also think that we do need to have that concern for community, as you point out, Ron. The thinking in terms of bringing the greatest love, happiness, care, good, however you want to define it, to the greatest number of people in thinking society is important. The deontology, Ron was just saying, the deontology is that those rules that grow out of the natural point when we turn away from self and begin to live in community with one another. And that's funny because, I have always sort of thought of deontology as the first step, is the way in which we teach how to form those habits that we want. So you reversing that order is helpful for me. It is. I've never really
it is.
I think this is a helpful conversation, and sometimes even if it's, as I always, the students like, we just came back in the same place on this issue. I said, yeah, but I think we're different for the journey. I think that at the end of the day, when we have these conversations and talk about these issues of right and wrong and what we should do and what we shouldn't do, or what others should do and what others shouldn't do, or what we have to do to one another, and I think that we can be different for the journey as we do that. So.